April 18th, 1945. The small village of Langendorf, nestled in the rolling hills of rural Germany, lay under a blanket of early morning mist. The distant rumble of vehicles and the occasional sound of aircraft overhead were constant reminders that the world was still in the midst of conflict. In a modest stone cottage at the edge of town, Margarete Weber stood at her kitchen window, watching her 3 children gather eggs from their remaining chickens, believing that the worst was behind them now that the fighting had moved eastward. She had no idea that by nightfall, her act of compassion would forge a bond between former adversaries that would last lifetimes. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how one woman's courage in the final days of the European conflict transformed not only her family's future, but also challenged everything a young American soldier thought he knew about the people he had been fighting against. The spring of 1945 brought with it a strange mixture of dread and hope. For 37-year-old Margarete Weber, a widow whose husband Friedrich had been reported missing 2 years earlier on the Eastern Front, each day was a grueling exercise in survival. Her children, Lucas 13, Eva 11, and little Heinrich, just 7, had grown accustomed to their mother's resourcefulness, stretching meager rations, trading hand-sewn clothing for vegetables, and maintaining their small farm with the stubborn determination that had become characteristic of German civilians in the rural areas. "Children, breakfast," Margaret called from the doorway, her voice carrying across the misty garden. The 3 children came running, Heinrich clutching 3 brown eggs proudly in his small hands. "Look, Mutti, the speckled hen was hiding these," he exclaimed, his childish delight momentarily masking the gravity of their circumstances. Margarete smiled, brushing back a strand of her chestnut hair that had escaped her practical bun. "Wonderful, Heinrich. That means porridge with eggs today," she said, though privately she calculated how to make 3 eggs stretch for 4 people. The Weber family lived just outside Langendorf, a village that had largely escaped the direct impacts of the conflict, but the war had taken nearly everything from them nonetheless. Friedrich, a schoolteacher who had been drafted despite his initial opposition to the regime, had written beautiful, cryptic letters until the correspondence abruptly stopped in 1943. Margaret had received the official notification of his status as missing in action near Stalingrad months later, but she held on to hope with the same tenacity with which she held on to their farm. That morning, as they ate their simple breakfast, 13-year-old Lucas listened intently to the family's hidden radio, a dangerous possession in those days. "The American forces are approaching from the west," he reported quietly, his young face serious beyond his years. "Herr Müller says they might reach us within days." "We will remain in our home," Margaret stated firmly, having already decided against evacuation. "We have done nothing wrong. We will meet whatever comes with dignity." Eva, practical like her mother, asked, "Should we hide the chickens? The soldiers might take them." "We will cross that bridge when we come to it," Margaret replied, though she had already dug a small space beneath the chicken coop, where the birds could be temporarily concealed if necessary. What the Weber family did not know was that 30 miles to the west, Technical Sergeant James Miller of the 79th Infantry Division was riding in a convoy advancing toward their region. A 24-year-old former factory worker from Pennsylvania, Miller had been in Europe since shortly after D-Day. His unit had fought their way through France, experiencing the full intensity of the conflict, and now, as they pushed into Germany itself, Miller found himself conflicted about the mission ahead. "What do you think these German towns will be like, Sarge?" Private First Class Thomas Rodriguez asked as their truck bounced along the road. Miller adjusted his helmet and considered the question. "Command says to expect resistance in some areas, acceptance in others. They say most civilians are just waiting for this all to be over." "Hard to believe we're actually in Germany now," commented Corporal William Jackson, checking his equipment for the 100th time that day. "After all this time fighting them, it feels strange." "Remember your training," Miller responded automatically, though privately he wondered what awaited them. The propaganda imagery of fanatical resistance had been drilled into them, but intelligence reports were suggesting the German military was collapsing and civilian morale was at rock bottom. The 79th Division had received orders to secure several small towns and villages in the region, establishing control while searching for any remaining pockets of resistance. Their command had emphasized treating civilians correctly, maintaining discipline, and avoiding any actions that would hinder the post-war reconstruction that was already being planned. By mid-afternoon, unexpected mechanical troubles forced the convoy to split up. The advance units continued forward, while several vehicles, including Miller's truck, pulled off for repairs. As the mechanics worked, Miller studied his maps, noting that several small villages, including one called Langendorf, lay in their path. At the same time, in Langendorf itself, the situation was rapidly changing. A German military transport truck had broken down at the village crossroads, and the soldiers, young, exhausted men barely out of their teens, were trying to repair it while keeping an eye on the western approach road. "They should leave," whispered Ava to her mother, as they observed the scene from the hill above the village on their return from trading eggs for salt with a neighboring farmer. "The Americans will be coming soon." Margaret hushed her daughter. "It is not our place to say such things aloud," she murmured, though she silently agreed. The presence of any military personnel, however few, might bring unwanted attention to their village. By late afternoon, the skies that had been clear began to darken ominously. Spring thunderstorms were common in this region, and soon fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. The Weber family hurried home, securing their animals and windows against the intensifying storm. Several miles away, Technical Sergeant Miller and his group had completed their repairs and were back on the road, trying to catch up with their unit, despite the deteriorating weather. The rain reduced visibility, and the roads, already damaged by years of neglect and military traffic, became treacherous. "We should find shelter and wait this out," suggested the driver, Private Henry Wilson, as lightning flashed across the sky. Miller considered their options. They were behind schedule, but risking an accident would only delay them further. "There should be a village a few miles ahead, Langendorf. We can stop there briefly until the worst passes." The decision seemed purely practical, but it would prove to be pivotal for everyone involved. In Langendorf, the stranded German soldiers had abandoned their repair efforts in the downpour and sought shelter in the village hall. Most of the villagers stayed in their homes, doors locked, windows shuttered against both the storm and the uncertainty of what the coming days would bring. Margaret had just put a pot of potato soup on the stove when the first distant rumble of vehicles could be heard over the storm. Lucas ran to the window, wiping the condensation away to peer outside. "American vehicles," he reported, his voice a mixture of fear and curiosity. "3 trucks." "Step away from the window," Margaret instructed calmly. "Heinrich, Eva, come sit at the table. We will have our dinner as usual." But the evening would prove to be anything but usual. The American convoy entered Langendorf cautiously. The village appeared deserted in the storm, with no signs of the German military presence that had been there just hours earlier. The soldiers, wet and tired, proceeded slowly down the main street. What happened next was described differently in various accounts. Some would later say it was a lightning strike that did it. Others believed it was structural damage from earlier in the conflict that finally gave way. What is certain is that as Technical Sergeant Miller's truck passed the old church bell tower, a tremendous crash echoed through the village. The ancient stone structure, weakened by years of vibrations from passing military vehicles and now battered by the storm, partially collapsed. Miller, who had been standing in the truck bed to get a better view of their surroundings, had no time to react. Massive stones and timber came down, the truck swerved and he was thrown clear, only to have rubble rain down around and upon him. The other American soldiers scrambled from their vehicles, shouting for medics and taking defensive positions, unsure if they were under attack. Within moments, they realized it had been a structural collapse, but in the confusion and continuing downpour, they lost sight of where Miller had landed. In the Weber cottage, the crash brought everyone to their feet. "Stay here," Margaret ordered, grabbing her coat and a lantern. "Mother, no!" Lucas protested. "It could be dangerous." "Someone might need help," she replied simply, and before her children could argue further, she was out the door, leaning into the driving rain. Margaret made her way cautiously toward the church, where she could see the American soldiers searching frantically, calling out in English. Years earlier, before the war, she had worked as a hotel receptionist in Frankfurt, and had learned enough English to understand they were looking for someone. Then, in the beam of her lantern, she saw him, a figure half buried in rubble in the garden beside the church, several meters from where the Americans were searching. The soldier was unconscious, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his leg bent at an unnatural angle beneath fallen stones. Margaret had a split-second decision to make. The American soldiers were disoriented in the unfamiliar village and the storm. The collapsed building had created a maze of debris. They had not seen their comrade thrown clear of the immediate area, and most significantly, she could hear the distinct sounds of German voices now. The soldiers who had been stranded in the village hall were approaching, drawn by the commotion. What happened in the next few minutes would later be pieced together from multiple accounts. Margaret somehow managed to drag Technical Sergeant Miller's unconscious form away from the scene, through a garden gate, and along a narrow passage between buildings that led eventually to the back of her property. How a slender woman moved a grown man through such a distance was later attributed to the extraordinary strength that can come in moments of crisis. By the time she reached her cottage, she was soaked and exhausted. Lucas opened the door in shock at the sight of his mother, dragging an unconscious American soldier. "Quick!" Margaret gasped. "Help me get him inside." The Weber children, raised to be resourceful, asked no questions in that moment. 13-year-old Lucas took the soldier's shoulders while Margaret carried his legs. Together they brought him into the small front room and laid him on the floor before the fireplace. "Eva, fetch clean cloths and water. Lucas, stoke the fire. Heinrich, bring my sewing basket and the first aid supplies," Margaret instructed, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she had just done. As she cut away the fabric of his uniform to assess his injuries, Technical Sergeant James Miller began to regain consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to alarm as he realized he was in an unknown location, surrounded by civilians speaking German. "Still," Margaret said in her limited English, placing a gentle but firm hand on his shoulder as he tried to rise. "You are hurt. We help." Miller's training told him to escape, to rejoin his unit, but the searing pain in his leg and the dizziness that overwhelmed him when he tried to move made that impossible. And there was something in the steady gaze of the woman tending to him and the frightened but curious eyes of the children that made him pause. "My unit," he managed to say. "Storm," Margaret replied, mimicking rain with her fingers. "Morning. Rest now." Outside, the chaos continued. The American soldiers, unable to find their missing sergeant in the storm and darkness, established a perimeter around the village. The German soldiers, realizing they were outnumbered, had melted away into the countryside, taking their disabled vehicle with them. The village held its collective breath, caught between two forces, as the storm raged on. In the Weber cottage, Margaret worked through the night. Miller's injuries were serious but not life-threatening. A broken leg, a concussion, numerous lacerations and bruises. She splinted his leg using techniques she had learned during civil defense training, stitched his deeper cuts with the same precision she applied to mending clothing, and regularly checked his awareness to monitor the concussion. The children, initially frightened, became increasingly curious about their unexpected guest. 7-year-old Heinrich was particularly fascinated by the Americans' equipment, his helmet, compass, and the photos he carried of his family back in Pennsylvania. By morning the storm had passed. Technical Sergeant Miller, though still in considerable pain, was fully conscious and faced the remarkable reality of his situation. He was in the home of a German family, the very people he had been fighting against, receiving care he might not have survived without. "Why?" he asked Margaret simply, as she changed the bandage on his forehead. "Why help me?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering how to bridge the language barrier. Finally, she touched her heart. "Mensch," she said, using the German word that means both human and humane. Then she pointed to him and repeated, "Mensch." It was Eva who provided unexpected assistance with communication. The 11-year-old had been learning English in school before education had become sporadic due to the war. Between her school English, Margarete's remembered phrases from her hotel days, and Miller's few German words, they established a rudimentary ability to converse. "American soldiers look for you," Eva explained haltingly, German soldiers also in village. Very dangerous. Miller understood then the risk this family had taken. Harboring an enemy soldier could have resulted in severe consequences from either side. "Thank you," he said, the words inadequate for the debt he felt. As the day progressed, Margaret faced a difficult decision. The American forces had established control of Langendorf overnight. They were conducting house-to-house searches, presumably looking for both their missing sergeant and any German military personnel. It would only be a matter of time before they reached the Weber cottage. "We must tell them you are here," Margaret told Miller through Ava's translation. "But we are afraid." Miller understood their fear. Civilians in occupied territories often suffered regardless of their personal actions or political views. He had seen it in France and Belgium. The suspicion, the summary judgments, the assumption of guilt by association. "I will protect you," he promised, pointing to his sergeant's insignia. "You saved my life." When American soldiers finally reached their door later that afternoon, it was Miller himself who called out to them from inside the cottage, using the recognized authentication codes to prevent any hasty actions. The soldiers' surprise at finding their missing sergeant alive, being cared for by a German family, quickly turned to relief and then curiosity. Captain Robert Thompson, who had taken command of the local detachment, was summoned to the Weber cottage. He listened with growing astonishment as Miller recounted how Margaret had pulled him from the rubble, hidden him from potential capture, and tended his injuries through the night. "I want this family protected," Miller stated firmly. "They put themselves at great risk to save an American life." Captain Thompson, a pragmatic man who had seen the worst of the conflict, recognized both the military value of positive civilian interactions and the simple human good in what had occurred. "They will be under our protection," he assured Miller, "and I'll see about getting proper medical attention for you." What followed over the next weeks would prove transformative for both the Weber family and Technical Sergeant Miller. As the American forces established a more permanent presence in the region, the Weber cottage became an unexpected bridge between the occupiers and the local community. Miller, transferred to a field hospital but insisting on maintaining contact with the family, used his influence to ensure they received extra rations during a time of critical food shortages. When it was discovered that Margaret had skills as a translator, she was offered employment with the local military government office, a position that provided stability for her family when so many Germans faced desperate circumstances. 13-year-old Lucas, initially the most suspicious of the Americans, found an unexpected mentor in Corporal William Jackson, who had been a mathematics teacher before the war. Jackson recognized the boy's aptitude for engineering and began tutoring him in the evenings, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become Lucas's distinguished career in rebuilding Germany's infrastructure. Ava's facility with languages flourished as she became an unofficial mascot of the American unit, learning English phrases from the soldiers who, missing their own families, showered her with attention and small gifts of chocolate and chewing gum. Her early exposure to English would later enable her work with international relief organizations during the post-war reconstruction. Even young Heinrich benefited from the unusual arrangement. His childhood had been dominated by propaganda and privation. Now, through Miller and his fellow soldiers, the boy encountered different perspectives, behaviors, and values. The Americans' casual kindness and their willingness to share their rations with German children contradicted everything he had been taught about the enemy. By the time Miller was well enough to be reassigned 6 weeks later, the bonds formed between him and the Weber family transcended national identities. On his last evening in Langendorf, Margaret prepared a special meal, using ingredients the Americans had provided to create as close an approximation to a Pennsylvania Sunday dinner as possible. "When I return to America," Miller said that night, his German now much improved through daily practice, "I will tell everyone about the Weber family and how you showed me that humanity exists even in the darkest times." Margaret, who rarely spoke of her own experiences, shared something that evening she had told no one else. "Friedrich, my husband, wrote to me before he went missing," she said softly as Ava translated. "He told me that he had helped a Russian family escape a dangerous situation, against orders. He said, 'If we forget our humanity, then what has all this been for? "I did not save you because you were an American. I saved you because that is what Friedrich would have done." After the formal German surrender, as occupation policies were implemented across the defeated nation, many German civilians faced hardship, suspicion, and collective blame. But in Langendorf, the story of the Weber family's compassion created a different atmosphere. Captain Thompson, impressed by what he had witnessed, cited the case in his reports as evidence that rehabilitation and cooperation, rather than punishment, should guide occupation policies. When food shortages became critical during the winter of 1945–46, it was Technical Sergeant Miller, now back in Pennsylvania but maintaining correspondence, who organized a community relief effort, sending packages of supplies addressed to the Weber family, Langendorf, American Occupation Zone, Germany. The packages always contained coffee for Margaret, books for Lucas, art supplies for Eva, and baseball equipment for Heinrich, along with essentials that were nearly impossible to obtain in post-war Germany. In 1947, Miller used his veterans' benefits to enroll in college, becoming a teacher. His first published academic paper, which gained attention in policy circles, was titled "Compassion as Reconstruction Policy," a case study from occupied Germany. In it, he argued that individual human connections, rather than broad policy directives, were the true foundation of rebuilding war-torn societies. Margaret Weber never remarried, dedicating herself to her children and community. By 1950, she had established a small but successful translation service, helping to bridge communications between occupation authorities and local government. Her reputation for fairness and integrity made her an invaluable intermediary during the complex early years of rebuilding. Lucas Weber, following his informal education with Corporal Jackson, earned an engineering scholarship to study in America in 1954, sponsored in part by James Miller. After completing his studies, Lucas returned to Germany to participate in the economic miracle of Reconstruction, eventually overseeing major infrastructure projects that helped reconnect his divided nation. Eva's linguistic talents led her to work with international organizations coordinating refugee resettlement. Her first-hand understanding of displacement and loss made her particularly effective in helping families torn apart by the conflict to reunite across newly established borders. Heinrich, the youngest, perhaps demonstrated the most remarkable transformation. The boy who had been born into a society defined by conflict grew up to become a dedicated teacher of international relations, frequently using his family's story as an example of how individual choices can transcend national enmities. In 1960, 15 years after their first encounter, James Miller returned to Germany with his wife and children. The reunion in Langendorf, now a thriving town in the new Federal Republic, was covered by local newspapers as a symbol of reconciliation and friendship rising from the ashes of conflict. When asked by a reporter what she had thought when she made the decision to rescue an enemy soldier, Margaret Weber replied simply, "In that moment I did not see an enemy. I saw a young man, not so different from my husband, who needed help. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the greatest power to heal our broken world." The relationship between the Weber family and James Miller continued for decades. They exchanged letters, shared important life events, and created a bond that extended to the next generation. Miller's children grew up calling Margaret Oma, grandmother, while the Weber children considered the Millers their American family. Perhaps most poignantly, in 1989, an elderly James Miller and Heinrich Weber, now a distinguished professor, stood together at the Brandenburg Gate as the Berlin Wall began to come down. Two men from former enemy nations, whose connection began in the rubble of conflict, witnessed together the moment that symbolized the end of the post-war division. "My mother always believed this day would come," Heinrich told a reporter who noticed the unusual pair, an American veteran and German professor, embracing tearfully as the first sections of the wall were breached. "She taught us that walls between people fall first in individual hearts, then in the wider world." The legacy of that rainy night in 1945 extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The Weber-Miller story became part of Langendorf's identity, taught in local schools as an example of moral courage. The house where Technical Sergeant Miller recovered from his injuries was eventually designated a small historical site, with a simple plaque commemorating a moment of humanity that transcended conflict. Historians later identified the Weber case as one of many unrecorded instances where individual acts of compassion created islands of reconciliation amid the broader currents of post-war suspicion. These personal connections, multiplied across countless villages and towns, formed an invisible network that helped sustain human dignity during the challenging transition from conflict to peace. What began as a simple decision, a widow's choice to help an injured human being, regardless of nationality, rippled outward through decades, touching hundreds of lives through its example. The story reminds us that even in history's darkest chapters, individual conscience can prevail over collective hatred, and that true healing begins with recognition of our shared humanity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.